These extraordinary tortoise-shaped gravestones date back to the Dark Ages. They were found in the graveyard of this 19th century Scottish church, along with these massive things. There's nothing else like them anywhere in Scotland, so they were obviously pretty important. But who exactly was buried here and why? Can Time Team find the answer to this riddle? Or will the origin of these stones always be hidden in the fog of Scotland's Celtic past?
Govan, the present church. You can see it's that big building.
It's a really odd shape in the landscape, isn't it?
It does stick out. It's very incongruous, doesn't it? You can see this sort of oval, pear shape.
Day one, and an early start so we can get a bird's eye view of what could be our most difficult site to date. This is Govan on the banks of the River Clyde, and that's our site, the pear-shaped graveyard of the parish church. Archaeology in a graveyard, even one like this which has been closed to burials for 80 years, is a nightmare. At least 11 successive generations have been buried here, and we must try to avoid digging up the grandparents of the present Govanites while we search for the earliest occupants of the site. Occupants who marked their graves with elaborately carved stones. Govan's 19th century minister recovered 30 stones from the graveyard. The present incumbent wants us to solve the riddle that no one has been able to answer. Why are they here? It's a particularly tall order for just 3 days because a week ago our lead archaeologist Mick Aston went and broke his leg looking for a holy well, so he can't be here. But we do have with us Anna Ritchie, who's a leading expert on the Scottish Dark Ages. Anna, this looks such an inappropriate place for a historical site of any significance. Are we really likely to find anything interesting here?
It has to be a really important site. It's the only way to explain why there's such a very big collection of wonderful early Christian sculpture. And it dates from between about the mid-9th century and the mid-11th century.
So what might we be looking for?
Well, aside from the sculpture, the other big clue that we've got is the fact that, you see, the boundary of the modern churchyard is rounded. Well, now, if that churchyard belonged to the present church, it ought to be square or rectangular. That's the normal shape. This sort of rounded enclosure is very much earlier, and it's typical of early Christian graveyards. And you see the way that the church juts out over the edge of the boundary.
Yes.
Well, that, I think, proves that the boundary is older than the modern church, and therefore there must have been an early church, perhaps a little more central to the enclosure.
Which was exactly what Carenza was looking for at the bottom of a trench dug here last year by Glasgow University.
And they found this wall. Steve, that's part of the wall in the section there, isn't it?
Yes, we removed it in the hope that we would find some artefacts to help date it.
But
we didn't.
How do you know it's medieval?
Well, we think it's medieval because we think it's early medieval because there's no mortar built into it, and it's really in the 12th century when they start building proper mortar churches in Scotland. And we also know that it's reasonably old because we've gone through the foundation demolition rubble of earlier churches. So for instance, here's slates from one of the post-medieval churches, and there's quite likely to be a sequence of medieval ones.
We're under the path here, as you can see. The trench was deliberately put on the path because we know it's been there since the 18th century. Therefore, there aren't going to be any recent burials there.
Yeah.
So hopefully we won't disturb any of that. What we want to do is extend this trench back towards the church, again hoping we won't hit any burials, but hoping that we may find the continuation of this wall, maybe find a corner or something that would tell us what direction it was going in. It's aligned east-west, which of course is really encouraging, possibly it might be an early church.
10 o'clock, and Carenza starts her search for the evidence to prove Steve's theory that he's found the foundations of the earliest church to stand in this ancient graveyard. But I'm not sure what connection an early Christian site would have had with the carved stones at the centre of our riddle. You call these hogbacks, don't you?
It's the curving shape of the back is why it's called hogback.
So were they meant to be anything at all?
Yes, they're tombstones which were meant to look like houses. They were very popular in northern England amongst the Danish settlers. The odd thing is that you don't get anything like this in the Scandinavian homeland, only in Britain. It seems that once the Danish settlers were in northern England, for some reason, these were invented to suit their taste.
And then they moved up here and it was the fashion up here.
That's right.
And presumably they just signify the little houses that people would live in after they were dead?
Yes, yes.
What about these ones here? Are these of the same sort of period?
These are probably a bit earlier, Tony.
And what we have on this stone is a very simple linear cross. And then at the bottom, we have this image of the figure on horseback. With the hogbacks, we have influence coming up from northern England. And the Christianity in this area was heavily influenced also by Irish Christianity and the west of Scotland. And we've already seen the Pictish influence coming in from the northeast. Govan was almost the centre of a small medieval world.
Over this weekend, we're going to copy the work of the stonemasons who lived in this small medieval world and carved the ancient stones. By the end of 3 days, this piece of sandstone will hopefully be the latest addition to the collection in the church. I'm told 1,000 years ago there was a flourishing school of stonemasons here, but we're going to try and recreate their work with just the help of Phil and Victor. Meanwhile, it's lunchtime, and our first trench, which we deliberately put on the path to avoid modern graves, has unearthed a burial. Over here?
Yep.
What can you tell about this body?
Well, first thing is it's all a jumble. It's disarticulated. We've got the skull here. We've got the thigh bone here. A lower leg there. So it's just a jumble, and they're not all that old. You've got a wee stain on the forehead of where a shroud pin has been resting. So it looks like we're looking at something which is 200 or 300 years old, not 1,000 years old.
So do we have to stop and tell somebody about the body?
But no, I think as long as we record it properly and understand the context it's coming from, we can lift it and take it away. It shouldn't hold us up too much.
So we can carry on?
We can carry on.
Oh, that's a relief. Cheers. So what's this map?
This is Blau's map. It's the earliest map we've got of this area.
1654.
You can see here it shows Govan, and it's called Meckle Govan.
What does it mean?
There's a bit of dispute about that. But the latest opinion indicates that it refers to a small hill or hillock.
That's interesting because when we look at General Roy's map of about 1750, Robin?
Circa 1750, yes.
Here's Govan again, still called Meckle Govan. There's the church and its churchyard. And you can see just here this little C-shaped smudge. So what it is a small mound, which would fit exactly with what you say the name was. If in the 12th century it was called Govan and that name means a small mound, then that suggests this mound, which we know was here in the 17th, 18th century, was still there in the 12th century.
I suspect they used the top of it as an open-air meeting place for administrational purposes. And
is there anything of it left?
Not anymore. It's been flattened, unfortunately. What we're hoping, though, is we might be able to find the ditch that would have gone round it, simply because if you're going to build a mound, you must have a ditch.
If we can prove there was an important law hill here, close to our Dark Age graveyard, then we may well have a major ceremonial site. But to find that out, we have to dig our biggest trench ever. And because we're digging it in Govan's main car park, it'll have to be fenced off. The mound, or Moot Hill as it's known locally, was described in the 18th century as being 17 feet high and 150 feet in diameter. Our trench will be 14 metres wide and 3 metres deep. But it doesn't matter whether you work in imperial or metric, this area has been built on for centuries. So it will take at least a day before we get deep enough to reach even the later medieval layers. Still, it'll be worth the wait. Finding a ditch in all of this will be a fantastic achievement.
This is a 18th century engraving when the mound was still standing. What's happened since then is the mound's been levelled, but the ditch, with a bit of luck, should still show where it was cut down and below the area which is
So where's the ground level now, according to this? If we took
Well, I
a
think
section?
the modern ground level is probably about across there.
It's really very high then.
It is. It's probably been built up quite a lot. But the ditch is still, you can see the line of the ditch there if you draw that in. That's why we have to go down so deep to get to the land surface that was left when the mound was levelled, and hopefully that land surface will have the ditch cut into it.
Now, if our Moot Hill and our Dark Age church were in use at the same time, then these two ceremonial sites would have been connected by a processional roadway, and the more impressive the entrance to the graveyard of this road, the more important the site.
So we've got roads coming up the hill, and they're coming through here, and we've got this really big entrance with fancy buildings and a great entranceway. Is that how you see it?
This is the pointy end of the pier, if you like. And it must be the principal entrance. It should have an impressive gate. And for instance, last year, our dig, which was right at the end of this pathway, produced areas which we interpret as workshops. That's something which we would expect to find around the perimeter.
So if you've got all that, why the devil didn't you go on down in here?
Well, we just ran out of time.
Is there any chance we can extend it back?
We're going to have to take it back a couple metres.
We'd better get these slabs up then.
So in the 9th and 10th centuries, this may have been a grand entrance into an impressive enclosure filled with workshops clustered around a central church. But who could warrant such a magnificent burial ground? Local legend has it this was the final resting place of St. Constantine. But it seems Robin and Anna are about to challenge that legend.
What date would you put on it?
Judging by the style of the carving, it's mid-9th century, and that makes it the very earliest piece of sculpture on the site.
The only question is whether we're dealing with a saint, and I noticed there's no cross of any kind in the carving, although I suppose one could have been on the missing lid, or a kingly aristocratic figure, and it's got to be pretty aristocratic to merit this kind of labour.
I think the latter, honestly, because, well, you have images here of the aristocrats, the image of hunting, the man on horseback. And for such an elaborate coffin, I think it has to be a king, a 9th century king of Strathclyde.
But you're not that happy about that, presumably?
It's one theory, and it's a very fine theory, but each of the images on the box can be interpreted in more than one way. It could be the Christian preacher hunting for the unconverted soul, represented as the stag or the wild boar.
Oh, that sounds like special pleading, doesn't it?
Top theory.
But I mean, if it is a kingly burial, and this is the earliest piece of carving that we've got on this site, then we could very well be considering this area as the royal burial place of the kings of Strathclyde.
If Robin and Anna are right, then 900 years ago, this was the final resting place of the ancient kings of this region. But so far, nobody's been able to tell me why they were buried here in Govan. I was pinning my hopes on the answers being several metres down in our big trench. Oh yes, and on Stuart.
Stuart, you've been very quiet and pensive all day. What's going on?
I thought I got 5 minutes, but I've got there's so much happening in this area, and there's so many ideas are being generated looking at all the history of the site and what's going on, and I'm beginning to get some ideas about what might be going on. I'm a little bit concerned about some of the suggestions for the site at the moment.
In what way?
Well, I'm beginning to think that the Moot site here, for instance, it might have other explanations. It might be a Norman motte, which is the mound for a Norman timber castle, which would have controlled a major crossing of the river here.
So it could be Mott as in Mott and Bailey rather than Moot meaning
exactly.
A meeting place?
Yeah, and that name often gets interchanged in records and maps over the years. At the head of the Clyde Valley is Dumbarton Rock, which was a citadel of the kings of Strathclyde. We know the Vikings raided it in 870. It's a very important strategic point. So after they captured the rock, they could have come up here in their boats. This doesn't sit here in isolation. It's not a cemetery by itself, it's not a monastic enclosure by itself. It's somehow linked to that major political centre just up the road.
How far is Dumbarton Rock from here?
It's about 10-15 miles, something like that.
Can you see Dumbarton Rock just starting to appear on the horizon there?
Oh, yeah.
It's sticking up, really very, very prominent.
Yes, I can just see the mouth of the river there.
Guarding the mouth of the river.
6 o'clock, and Carenza and I were back in the helicopter for a trip up the Clyde. I wanted to see where the people who buried their dead in Govan had actually lived.
You suddenly get this enormous protrusion, really, sticking up, and it's very, very defensible. You can see how steep the sides of it are.
Citadel of the ancient kings of Strathclyde. As long as you could hold on to this, then you knew that nothing could sail past you and get up into the land around Govan and Glasgow. And likewise, if anybody was there, they couldn't get past you and back out to sea again. But if it was so important and so impregnable, how come they were burying important people just 10, 15 miles upriver in Govan? Join us after the break and we'll try and find out.
Saturday's market day in Govan, and guess where they hold the market? Right on top of our big trench. Now, Robin and Carenza tell me this is a good sign that our ancient hillock was a moot site and not, as Stuart's suggesting, a Norman castle. They say a modern market on the same spot shows continuity of use with a medieval meeting place. But we still have a long way to go in our big trench before we can discover if our Dark Age tomb makers bought their fruit and veg here 900 years ago. And Stuart still thinks we've got it wrong.
You can see it's a monumental piece of earthwork, isn't it? And I've been looking at where it occurs in relation to the landscape. There's a distribution map of mottes here, and there's a whole lot of them in this region. But interestingly, there isn't one at Govan, and there should be, because this is a major crossing of the Clyde. And I'm beginning to wonder if what we've in fact got is a site that, looking at that view, looking at this view of one called Dinvim Mott, not too far away, the two are remarkably similar.
Yes.
And if you take that, which is a very substantial, similar-sized castle site, and look at the reconstruction that we've built up here, when you look at them together, the three of them, they're very, very similar indeed, aren't they? It looks very, very substantial and good, doesn't it?
Persuasive, yes.
There's a lot of evidence that this is a major, undocumented castle site.
So do we have a motte or a moot hill? The only way to prove who's right is to find some archaeology down there.
It's 5 to 10, day 2, and the Moot Hill Trench is really getting somewhere. It's a huge excavation job, but they reckon they'll be down on the archaeology in about 35 minutes. This trench, though, the one that was trying to establish a link between the church and the Moot Hill, which is beyond this building here, is more of a problem. Have you found anything at all in it?
Not very much, no.
Nothing?
Nothing, no.
Can't win them all, can you?
Okay.
This one's quite exciting, though. This is the trench where we found that body yesterday. They've started pulling out evidence of more graves that are old. They're much older than the body, but they're not as old as the big stones in the church. And they're presenting Carenza with a bit of a problem. Carenza? Carenza?
Oh, hi, Tony.
What exactly is the problem?
Well, basically we found 3 probable grave cuts in this trench.
Yeah.
And they seem to be laid out along the wall, or along the same alignment as the wall.
What, the dry stone wall that you found yesterday?
Well, the rubble on top of it, yes.
Yeah.
And because what this is suggesting is that the graves may have been dug at a time when the wall was still standing, but the graves are a lot later. We've got 14th century pottery has come from within the fill of one of them, and of course you can't fill a grave with 14th century pottery until the 14th century, or much later, of course.
So we think that the wall is older than the 14th century?
It could have been built at the same time as the hogbacks, for example. but the wall could have kept standing, the building could have continued in use up to a much later time when these graves were cut. I'll show you, look. This is the grave here, another grave cut. This is producing the 14th century pottery. What we would really like to do is find a layer which this grave has cut, which butts up against the wall, and that'll help us try and date the relationship between the wall and the graves. Was this grave cut when the wall on top of that pre-12th century foundation is still standing?
I'll be asking questions at the end of the programme. But actually all that boils down to is this. We know that the 12th century church was still standing here in the 14th century when the grave was dug. If our wall was still standing then, it was part of that church. That's the good news. The bad news is that this may well mean it was built 200 years too late to be associated with our stones. And speaking of stones, we've started our crash course in medieval stone carving. Step 1, get Victor to draw on your design.
So I think I'm beginning to get the picture now. The idea is then we just simply put the charcoal on, design, and then we go over it with a paint, and then, is that it?
Then I'll start scribing.
Scribing?
Just getting a sharp implement and drawing it along, just to break the surface of the stone so that that line's then permanent.
Yeah.
So that if the design gets washed off, if it rains, the impression's still there.
Meanwhile, GeoPhys have been given the task of searching the graveyard for any undiscovered stones that may still be buried there. We've got a 19th century map which shows all the post-medieval burial plots. So hopefully, any stone readings they produce in the gaps between the burials should be Dark Age in date. 12:30 day 2, and back at Trench 1, Steve's uncovered another burial.
And that's not redeposited bones, that's as it was buried.
Yep, that's a recent burial.
What's that at the edge there?
Well, that's how we know it's a recent burial. That's the inside of a decorative panel that is against the handle for the coffin.
So that's actually the handles you'd have lifted the coffin with?
Yeah, I mean, the wood's obviously gone, but...
You can see traces of it, can't you?
Yeah, just where it's kind of corroded onto the metal. So you've got the iron bits for the handle, and then...
What sort of date is that?
Well, these are 19th century, this kind of thing.
Lorenza?
Yeah?
Come and have a look at this.
What have you got in there?
Emptying more of the fill of this grave from which the pottery came from yesterday.
This is the 14th century pottery,
That's the one. And I've just unearthed, I think, more of the same vessel, which appears to have a face on it. If we gradually smooth away some of the... There's an eye and a nose.
And another eye.
And I think a mouth underneath.
That's wonderful. I'll take this bit over, shall I?
OK. There's another small piece to take with it. And I can carry on.
So we got more of this up here. Do you want to clean that up? Shove it in there and give it a scrub off. And clean it up with that's it. That's it, and then rinse that off. And then see.
How old was it?
It's about 14th century, so it's about 600 years old. And this looks like it's the edge of the handle of it, maybe, so you've got a big bowl like that you would lift it up and use sort of under his mouth as the handle. But you can see it's all the same. Yeah, you see you've got that ridge coming around there that joins on there. Brilliant, well done.
We can now reconstruct what it would have looked like.
Right, well this is the geophysics from the churchyard now. We've actually done the whole of the area. So the very light areas are the paths going around the perimeter. The white blocks are where we can't actually get the probes in the ground because of the graves that are there at the moment. I think there's two things of interest. One, there's a sort of really strange rectilinear shape, and right against the eastern boundary wall, there's three quite distinct blobs. There's some talk of lost stones. I think that would be a good target.
If we could actually find one of the missing stones, that would be wonderful for this weekend.
Stuart, you're trying to break it. You were looking at the maps, weren't you, for the river?
I'm quite excited by what John's just started to point out, because...
Excited by geophysics.
Over the last day or so, we've been starting to look at the river and the maps. One of the things that came out this morning, looking at the 1750 survey by Major General Roy, when you blow the map up, around the area of the church is a rectilinear enclosure.
You're suggesting that map actually means that the churchyard in 1750 was rectilinear. therefore this curving boundary is not that old.
I'm beginning to wonder if it might have appeared after 1750, and there's something very peculiar gone on here which we haven't been able to get to yet.
I'm still worried we're taking this Roy's map too literally here.
Do you feel that your maps and your geophysics is going to be accurate enough that you could drop us down somewhere where we're not going to find graves?
Well, therein the problem. I think that area is going to be full of graves.
Realistically, we have already hit upon 3 or 4 graves. I mean, we're not going to be terribly precious about this, are we?
We're not grave snatchers.
It's not that we have a terrible problem with the bodies, it's just that they have to be excavated properly and treated with respect. We can't just hack on through them.
It'd be far better if we went back this afternoon.
So if we start looking for those stones now, give John an hour and a half to do that work and process it, and provided that we've got some clear evidence, start work on another trench this afternoon.
I think so, yes.
Well, I'm glad we got that sorted. So, Claire fits a bigger probe to the geophys equipment, so she can look deeper into the soil for any traces of Stuart's square boundary, and we set out in search of those missing stones. So you're just going to prod for it?
Well, it's a good way to check.
Have a go?
You feel that?
Oh, there's definitely something there, isn't there?
Some of these slabs are really big. They can be 5 or 6 feet long.
We're off it there.
A whole row of stones were put up against the churchyard wall.
Yeah.
And although some of them were taken into the church, some went missing.
Oh, yes, look, it's definitely a beveled edge, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Oh, and it's got a...
Yes, look at this.
Yeah. I'm afraid that looks 19th century to me.
19th?
I don't think that's one of the early stones.
Much deeper. We may have drawn a blank with our first stone, but we'll have one more go before we give up.
Come on, Tony, see if you can... Oh, there is some shapes on that.
It's definitely a shape, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, there's only one thing more we can do. Make the hole bigger. Well, this is definitely very smashed.
Do you think that might be, Anna?
It doesn't look like an early Christian stone, I have to say. It looks like another 18th, 19th century tombstone, and you get all sorts of emblems carved on those.
So we're drawing another blank then?
I really felt good about this. I was sure that we were going to find some of those early Christian stones, even if they were fragmented, but you win some, you lose some.
Yeah, that's it. You don't want to build your hopes up too high all the time.
Come on.
Hi, Mick. How are you getting on in there? Where are all your diggers?
We lasted till 18 minutes into the match, and off down the pub they ran.
Oh no!
So we were hoping to find the ditch should be, appearing as we speak.
Whereabouts should it be roughly?
Actually, come in, I'll show you. See where?
Can I jump down?
Yeah, jump down. I've got a very dark, sandy material here. Very dark.
Right.
With sandy soil here, and outside the trench just over here, I've got a very lighter. Oh, there you go. Can you see the difference in that?
So basically, what do you reckon you've got here? Have you got a feature going across it, across the trench? Have you got something that looks like a ditch?
What I seem to have is a ditch going this way into the corner of the trench, sort of going off in that direction. We're off there and curving round, then going round here this way.
So do you think this curving edge could be the base of the mound?
I'm not sure yet.
If that is the edge of the mound, you might have the ditch further down.
Could be.
How long do you think it's going to take you before you've got anything definite on this? So can I go to the others and say, look, we found a mound? Not just yet. How
Not
soon?
yet. I'll phone you. I'll ring you.
Do you think you'll be able to get some results by the end of the day?
Yes, definitely.
Brilliant. Okay.
Back at the churchyard, Victor has now finished painting his design on our stone, and with some help from professional stone carver Barry Grove, Phil was about to swap his trowel for a chisel.
And then the mallet.
The mallet. Okay. The chisel.
The chisel. There then. Is there a right way and wrong way to hold this?
Just hold your right-handed.
Yeah, I'm right-handed.
Okay. Hold your chisel in your left hand, wrap your fingers round and lock it with your thumb.
Okay. And that is just a conventional chisel?
Yeah, well, the actual basic design of the chisel hasn't changed since Roman times. They used to have a whole crew of blacksmiths would follow the masons around any sort of building site, and they'd constantly be sharpening and re-edging the tools for them.
There's no hurry for the money, ladies. Climbing the next time you're passing. OK, we don't need the
5 o'clock, and it's fair to say the market traders have had a much more successful day than we've had. Despite Mick's earlier optimism and the return of the diggers, we haven't yet excavated enough in our big trench to be sure we've found the mound and ditch.
1.9.
And in the churchyard, our so-called entrance trench is well down to the medieval layers, but still seems empty. So maybe Stuart's right about the square boundary.
We've tried to do the deeper survey. We still can't find any evidence for either a curving ditch, a straight ditch, any sort of boundary. Now, it's difficult conditions. I mean, we always knew it was going to be. It's not easy for geophysics to see through where there's been lots of graves. But I can't actually come up with any evidence to say, go and dig there and you'll find something.
We can't just sort of randomly pop a trench in here and there in a graveyard. We're having enough trouble getting through the graves as it is.
Have we had any decent results today?
Well, no, we have made some progress in this trench. In fact, we've got, possibly 3 structures evidence of turning up in here. There's a big mortar lump here, which may be on top of an earlier unmortared structure below it. And also this cut that we looked at this morning, which we thought might have been a grave, looks like it may possibly be a post hole. If it's a post hole, then it's a structure. So it's all to play for, I think.
Yeah, but time team is so full of highs and lows, and today has been those really frustrating days where really nothing seems to have gone right. The geophys has been inconclusive, a lot of the trenches have been empty, and I honestly don't feel that I know anything more about the kings of Strathclyde or the carvings in the church than I did at the beginning of yesterday. But at least it looks like we might have found a post hole which could indicate, I don't know, a 9th, 10th century structure maybe. And inside it, we did find what I think is one of my most favourite finds on any of our programmes. I think he's laughing at us a bit. Start of day 3. We've got a flat tyre on the JCB. Meanwhile, Stuart's at it again. This time, he's convinced Steve's been looking for our entrance in the wrong place.
This is the 1809 survey.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is the enclosure wall going round here, isn't it? And that's where your trench is positioned in relation to the modern wall.
Yeah.
So we've got the two, we can say where your trench is now in relation to this. It's
and we've probably,
about there, and it looks as if you're a little bit south. And to test your supposition of an entrance through there, I think you probably would need to go about another 1.5 meters further north. You may just have missed it.
I think that's about all we have to go with.
It's the only way you can go, I think, is that direction at the moment. Is that okay?
Yeah, well, that's what we'll do.
Right.
It's 5 to 10, day 3, and we were going to have another crack at trying to find the entranceway to the cemetery, because if there's a king or a saint buried here, then that entranceway is going to be very elaborate. And also, if there's a direct alignment between the moot hill beyond that building there and the church over here, then that's going to imply some significant relationship between the two places. So that's what we were going to do, because that entranceway could be the key to understanding the whole site. But we can't do it because it's going to be at least another 2 hours before we can get a new tyre for the JCB. So instead, plan B. I'm going to go to church.
When archaeologists are digging up the past, sometimes things pop up quite quickly, and you can see what's there. It's that excitement of discovery that's made me, as you know, very keen in archaeology long before I became a minister. And that's why I'm so very glad that things are being dug up around us. But the important thing about Govan Old and our stones and our archaeology is that it's for sharing, so that other people in our community can rediscover how terribly special and how terribly exciting our community is.
Midday, And just as the service ends, the JCB, complete with new tyre, starts work on our second entranceway trench, at the pointed end of our pear-shaped graveyard.
Are we down to anything yet? Are you finding archaeology at this
Well, I think so. Down here, we're starting to get gravel, which just might be the metalling for this road we're looking for.
Great. So we might actually possibly have the road for the entranceway.
Yeah, so we really pretty much need to stop here with the machine and you know, get some archaeologists in here.
Right, so if we stop here, clean this up, do you think we're going to have time, and we were virtually at lunchtime on the last day, do you think we're going to have time to get...
Well, it won't take much time to clean this up, I mean, so we've got should be able to determine whether we have something here.
1:15, and it was worth the wait. We found a ditch in our big trench. But how old is it?
Hello, Tony.
What you got?
Why do you always come when I got some exciting finds? Look at that, enormous chunks of pot. Big old slice of the body there, and then there's a stack of 3 bits there. There's a big body piece there, and this bit here is the base. But we've already got some rather nice bits already. These are the bits we hit when we discovered it. What do you think it is, Bob?
I think it's part of a 14th century storage jar or cooking vessel.
And presumably, if we don't find anything much earlier than about the 13th century, then that adds fuel to Stuart's idea that this might just be the base of a Norman castle, whereas if we find Dark Ages stuff, then it's much more likely to be associated with the church site.
Well, unless we can get earlier material, we're not going to resolve it one way or the other, unfortunately. Yeah. I mean, the rest of the trench is going superbly well.
What does that mean?
Well, according to plan. I mean, you see, here we've got the edge of the ditch really, really clearly defined. This really, really yellow sand.
That's totally different from the earth
dipping
around
away
it,
down in there. God only knows where it's going. But you see, in behind you, the sun is awful for seeing this. But when this comes under the shade, make a bit of shade on there. You see these tip lines, you call them tip lines. You see this little yellow line there?
Yeah, one there too.
And there's another one there.
Yeah.
And here, we think might be the edge of the mound coming down.
So these are sort of stretch marks?
They're literally each layer of soil as it's tipped on, and then gradually the thing gets bigger and bigger and wider, and as you build that mound up, so you get these tip lines, and then as you push it out, you're never ever going to be able to totally remove the base of the mound. And I mean, since I've been working here, and certainly since I realised what the natural is, I mean, it's just got to be the biggest sandcastle in Scotland, really.
We now have less than half a day left, and while we're making great progress with our carving, we're still no nearer answering the riddle of the ancient Govan stones. In Trench 1, we've uncovered yet more burials, and as we'll have to struggle to excavate and record these new graves in the time left, it looks like we'll need to abandon our search for the early church. We do have a gravel entranceway in our new trench, but so far we've got no pottery or other finds to give us a date for it. Still, it seems GeoFizz have come up with something new.
A big black splodge.
Big black splodge. It's the strongest anomalies we've got.
It is, isn't it?
Really does stand out like a sore thumb.
This is the resistivity? So that's a hard lump of stone or something like that?
Yes. We're actually stood on top of it.
We're so short of time, aren't we, when it's 4 o'clock now? You want to know what that is?
Yes, please. I think we should go for it. Put it back.
It's not very substantial, is it?
This is not what's giving you the signal, is it? You'd expect something much bigger and stronger
I think
than
it
this.
must be. I mean, there's going to be dozens of these sort of small rubble concentrations throughout the graveyard. And
let's take that off and go down, shall we? Okay. Let's get moving because we're terribly short of time.
Meanwhile, over in the marketplace, we've got to the bottom of our ditch.
Whoa, Bob, that's a hell of a hole you've got there. Well, you're nearly finished.
Just about. We've a bit deeper than we'd hoped.
My God, that is a hole.
It is, it is.
You had to finish it with a machine then,
Machine,
did you?
yeah. Remember when you were here the last time, we're just getting the edge coming down. But you can see we've dug out a lot more, but it just got too deep.
Wow, you still haven't got the other side.
We've not got the side, we're just getting down, presumably the bottom of it now, but no sign of it going up.
So what you got then is probably a very deep, wide, U-shaped, you reckon, ditch? That's what it looks like,
yeah,
isn't it? And most importantly, you've got any finds out of it?
Got more pottery.
Yeah?
I think more of what you saw the last time.
Right, the 14th century stuff.
And some other, a little bit deeper down, much more abraded, much thinner, much more abraded, much more worn.
But how old?
Well, could be, I reckon it's more earlier than 14th. Just the condition it's in.
But is it going to go back 10th?
No, it's maybe 12th, late 12th, something like that.
So are we looking at a motte?
Could be. Massive ditch with pottery, so we found it.
Is that good for Govan?
I think so.
So Stuart was right about our mound being a Norman motte for a wooden bailey. Quite a big find for a weekend's work. But what about his theory of a square graveyard? Stuart, the archaeologists here and the vicar and everything that I read, like this Govan Heritage Trail pamphlet, says it's important that the graveyard was round from early times. The round-shaped graveyard of Govan Old Parish Church would suggest there was a community here long before the Romans arrived. For the past 24 hours, you've been saying that you think everyone's got it wrong. Why is that?
Well, I've been trying to look at the evidence for what date this circular round churchyard appears, and we don't find anything curvilinear until 1843. So we're still left with this enigma. In 1750, we've got a regular square enclosure around the church, and suddenly, 90 years later, part of it becomes a curvilinear feature. When you transfer these linear alignments onto the modern map, these red lines are Roy's survey, what you see is that these straight alignments actually are very similar to the alignment of the west side of the churchyard. And I'm wondering if somewhere between 1750 and 1843, the curved boundary has just been added to one side. I don't think anybody's really sat back and tried to find out when does this curved feature appear. It tends to have just been accepted. All I've done is use the evidence to question it. I can't provide any real answers, but this evidence is pretty good. You could get a conviction on this, I think, anyway.
And over in the graveyard, they were still searching for our geophysical big black splodge.
This is really thick sand.
Yeah, because that's not natural, is it?
Well,
So-
we do. I mean, there are deposits of sand in and around here, but not really. I haven't seen too much like that. No. I wonder whether we got a filled-in sort of burial vault or something.
But if it was a hollowed hole that had been filled in, that wouldn't give us that reading, would it, John?
It could well do. When you asked earlier, were we definitely looking at stones, my immediate response was yes. I was ignoring the fact that we could have sand-filled trenches, because sand is, in our terms, as like a rock. It really is dry.
Well, let's carry on. Well, the only way we're going to find out is by digging it out, isn't it?
Electric currents find it as difficult to go through dry sand as they do walls.
So it's just a sand pit with nothing in it. I mean,
Well, we're only looking at a very small section of a much bigger anomaly that stretches 5 metres that way. Any point in doing any more?
Well, if you think this explains the reading you had, the reason we dug the hole is because you found something that we wanted to know what it was. If this explains what it was, then I don't think there is there?
Nope.
Well, Steve, we've nearly finished here. Do you want us to backfill it?
Could be backfilled.
And while Carenza backfills, I had a phone call to make.
Hello?
Hi, Mick.
Yeah?
It's Tony.
Oh, Tony.
How you feeling?
Oh, not too bad, mate.
Anyway, how have you got on?
Well, it's been a funny old weekend, really. You know, we'd got this old moot hill.
Yeah.
And the feeling at the moment is that it's probably a Motte and Bailey castle.
Right.
Oh, that's very useful.
Yeah, it's useful, but it's sort of frustrating in that we wanted to find evidence of an earlier time. I know you're laughing, as you always say, you find what you find.
Well, yes, and I mean, I think we often set out with an agenda, don't we? And then we find that it's not like that at all.
We've dug 3 trenches here in the graveyard.
Yeah.
In one of them, just adjacent to the church, we found 3 or 4 stones put together.
That's a building, isn't it?
It's a building, definitely. Because the mortar isn't there, they're pretty certain it's pre-12th century. The one thing that fascinates me is that the surveyors seem to think that this circular graveyard is actually something that's very recent. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's a possibility. I mean, I know we all get excited about circular graveyards and we think they're early, but I mean, some recent work in Wales and Cornwall has shown that there's actually a terrific variety of shapes.
That's actually quite significant to even sort of come up with that.
But basically, you don't mind if we started off with a moot hill and a circular graveyard and ended up with a Mott and Bailey and a square graveyard?
No, I mean, I never have any preconceptions about these things.
I mean, life's just like that in archaeology.
I'll learn that one of these days.
It's 8 o'clock and time to go. We may not have solved the riddle of the stones this weekend, but at least we're leaving Govan our version of their ancient grave markers. It really is beautiful, isn't it?
It's lovely, isn't it? It's nice to see it painted. Superb.
What do you think we've got out of this weekend?
Well, I think we've actually done quite well, considering it was always going to be difficult. It's been made twice as difficult without Mick. But the trench and the churchyard, we have got some early archaeology that is earlier than the medieval pottery we're finding.
So, we've uncovered the oldest remains yet to be found on this site. The unmortared foundations of an ancient church wall. It's well below the 19th century grave we found on Saturday. And although we can't link it to our ancient burial stones, the wooden wall that sat on top of these foundations has to date back to well before the medieval stone church was built here. So what do you reckon was going on at that period? What's your bet?
I think we've got something pretty important going on here. Maybe a religious site, maybe a royal site. I think there's something going on here.
Robin?
What I reckon happened was that this became the burial place of the sub-kings of Strathclyde and the aristocrats of this kingdom. Again, a very, very important site.
We might not have solved the riddle of what was going on here, but we have got lots of little stories about it, lots of hypotheses, lots of theories. And I like to think that it means that the vicar can hold on to his idea that it was a religious site, and that Anna can hold on to her idea that it was essentially a kingly site. And as for the people of Govan, well, they can listen to all the stories and decide which one they want to adopt.